How are leaders chosen in your worldview?
I'd say either a dictator or some sort of head figure.
No, it was to protect the liberty of the states against the federal government. It was like literally that simple. He's talking about bodies, piles of women and children where he couldn't see over them. The idea that any of this is justified is
Democracy, of course, devolves into what it always becomes, which is mob rule, in which it is several gangs vying for political and, legitimacy amongst other gangs.
How are leaders chosen in your worldview?
I'd say either a dictator or some sort of head figure that was established and placed by the Catholic Church who is in accordance with the teachings.
My problem with that is that clearly there's less means to prevent the exact corruption you're talking about that exists in a democracy, that would exist in the church or in a monarchy. It just leaves the people with less ability to push back against that without democratic means to unseat that power. This is where you get more violent means of doing so, like regicide and things like, the killing of kings.
I can explain how in further detail if you want to give an example of where you believe the quote-unquote corruption existed.
Sure, we could talk about where corruption has existed. I'm just talking about in the hypothetical of where corruption arises in a democratic state and then in a theocratic state, the people have less means to push back against that corruption in your model.
I agree. Just one thing I'd like to add too is that in the democracy, there's more keys to power, which means there's less corruption. And of the systems that you're talking about, Australianist, there's less keys to power, so corruption is much more likely.
I am curious, would you agree with that?
No, I push back against that.
Okay.
I believe that by giving more keys, it does not necessarily mean there's going to be less corruption. It means that corruption is going to be more, how do I put it, more firm in regards. If the 51% has now gained control of the country, they can push back and basically put the 49% underneath them, which we see in a lot of politics.
No. I would have to.
Century that this was like really, really common.
Yeah, I would have to disagree just simple, like logically that doesn't track, right? If you need, you could just use a simple example of, let's say there's like a council of 5 people versus one dictator. If the council needs all 5 people to vote something in, that means you need 5 people down to do corruption versus a dictator who just needs 1. So if we're talking about that on a much more like macro level of like a democracy where like in America, it's hundreds of people in Congress, all of whom are voted in, and to do this type of power, if we're talking on the state level, obviously we're talking smaller amounts, but still multiple people, like state legislatures are like 20, 30 people. All of them would have to be in on this corruption to some level versus one person who just has top-down power. There's no one to stop him if he decides to do corruption. Whereas if one senator, if one senator wants to do corruption, but another senator doesn't, that acts as a counterbalance. But in a dictatorship, there is no counterbalance.
So what stops the 51% from punishing the 49% if they get the necessary requirements? Like, for example, in Nazi Germany, or we could go with Republican Spain, where this was the case, and the moment they became the majority, they instantly began abusing and arresting anyone who was against the state. But this is like perfectly fine because the check and balance was able to be passed merely just by populism.
Rights shouldn't be dictated by the majority or by democracy. They should be grounded in things that are empirical, a sort of moral compass, right? Which is how most societies do it. I would say that in terms of like what we consider like innate rights, those aren't democratically selected. Like we didn't have a democratic vote in America where we have a democracy. We would all agree America's a democracy. We never had a democratic vote on what human rights are, right? Like we've came to an understanding of what we consider human rights through shared values, through like, what'd you say? I'm sorry.
I said you have a Bill of Rights where you literally outline what rights are considered human.
No. To be clear, and I'm not sure if you're not American.
Countries that actually have the...
To be clear, the Bill of Rights gives states assurances against the federal government. I'm not sure if you're misunderstanding what the Bill of Rights is, but like there was a whole Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate. You could look into the papers, like the Federalist papers when these were written. The Bill of Rights was specifically constructed to give states assurances against the federal government because there were multiple states who weren't willing to sign on to the Constitution without these assurances. It has nothing to do with human rights or anything like that. It has to do with the state's ability to dictate rights against the federal government's overarching power.
Protecting fundamental rights and liberties of individuals.
No, it was to protect the liberty of the states against the federal government. It was like literally that simple. Was multiple states would not have signed on to the Constitution.
Okay, but when it comes to this, then okay, I can just point to this.
So
what stops changing morality from existing?
Well,
with people saying, okay, well, this thing is now considered acceptable.
Sure, I would say, well, one, I think that religion has the same problems, but I would say that grounding it in something empirical, right? I would say things like outcome, harm reduction, risk, those type of things, I think are how you best set morality. Objective isn't the right word, but it's how you best ground it outside of bias, right? Which I would, and this is my problem with a lot of theocrats, I guess I would say, is that you guys tend to put forth your morality as objective when it's not. I mean, there's like 40,000 different interpretations of what you guys would consider objective. But then, of course, you say that the one that I've picked is the objective one. But even then, that morality has changed over time. So it's like, I would say the same problems exist. Like what? I mean, well...
Like what? Could you give me an example?
Sure, like the Catholic Church did the Crusades.
Yeah, we morally accepted it till to this day. Like we say that it was absolutely fine, it was necessary with the Muslim invaders. Like I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, the Muslim threat that had ceased decades before. The decades before, and then the mass sexual violence, the beheading of civilians, the killing of even Christians. Like at one point, the Crusades diverting to Constantinople to kill Christians as well. These are things the church wouldn't sign on nowadays, right? Like I think is the point. And at one point you guys did sign off on them and justified them. I mean, which is just another problem with why theology shouldn't rule law, is because some of you will still try to justify things like the Crusades.
Absolutely, they said it was absolutely necessary. But like, I can't really send an image, since I got into an argument with a Bosnian Muslim about who was whiter, Serbs or Hitler. I can't really send images, but could you back up your claim with the Muslim caliphates ceased expansion and were no longer continuing to threaten Europe?
Sure, yeah. The last battle was 20 years prior to the Crusades. It was the Battle of Manzikert. This was started by the Byzantine Empire. The Christian forces launched that battle, and they just lost. But the Seljuk Empire had fractured due to the death of their sultan years prior to the request of military aid by the Christian forces. So yeah, like the idea that there was like some ever-present threat, like that's crazy, right? And then the idea even then that this threat allowed for the beheading of civilians, the killing of children. Like you have chroniclers like the Raymond of Aguilar detailing thousands of Muslims and Jews who are slaughtered indiscriminately, lined up in the street. He's talking about bodies, piles of women and children where he couldn't see over them. The idea that any of this is justified is and it's why people like you probably shouldn't run the government, because you'll justify things like this to this day.